Before we begin this forgotten chapter of World War II, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The coral sand of Peleliu burned white under the September sun, and Private First Class Reuben McNair could taste blood mixed with the salt spray that had soaked his uniform during the landing. It was 15:30 hours on September 15, 1944, and the 7th Marine Ammunition Company had been ashore for 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like 6 years. Around him, the beach was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken men. LVTs burning in the shallows, Marines crying for corpsemen. The staccato crack of Japanese machine guns echoing from the ridges that loomed like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. McNair's hands shook as he lifted another crate of ammunition onto his shoulder. They weren't supposed to be here. Not like this. The 7th Ammunition Company and the 11th Marine Depot Company were support troops. Segregated black Marines from Camp Montford Point who'd been trained to haul supplies, not to fight. White officers had made that crystal clear during training. You boys aren't combat material. Just get the ammunition where it needs to go and stay out of the way. But Peleliu didn't care about anyone's plans. Peleliu was hell with a coral reef, and hell needed every man who could hold a rifle. McNair. Douglas? Tucker! Sergeant James Thompson's voice cut through the chaos, hoarse from shouting over the bombardment. 7th Marines got hit hard on Orange 3. They're calling for volunteers. They need riflemen, and they need stretcher-bearers. Now, Private Lee Douglas, Jr. looked up from the ammunition he'd been sorting, his face streaked with coral dust and sweat. Riflemen? Sarge, we ain't infantry, we're depot company. Thompson's eyes were hard. You see any infantry left standing over there? Beach is a killing ground. Casualties are running 40% in some companies. They need bodies with rifles. You qualified on the Garand, didn't you? Yeah, but then you're infantry now. All of you. Grab your rifles and follow me. McNair felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was it. Everything they'd trained for at Montford Point, everything they'd endured. The segregation and the doubt and the white officers who'd treated them like they were less than soldiers, all of it came down to this moment. They were about to prove something, or they were about to die trying. He looked at the others gathering around Thompson. Private Samuel Love from the 11th Depot Company, quiet and steady. Corporal Marcus Henderson, who'd grown up in Harlem and still carried a photograph of his mother in his helmet liner. Private William Taylor, barely 20 years old, who'd lied about his age to enlist. Private Eugene Foster, who'd been a longshoreman before the war and could lift ammunition crates that took 2 other men to move. And Private James Whitfield, who carried a small Bible in his breast pocket and read it every night before sleep. 6 men, 6 black Marines who weren't supposed to see combat, who were supposed to stay in the rear with the supplies, who the Marine Corps had trained for 4 weeks instead of the 12 weeks white Marines received, because they weren't expected to need real combat training. 6 men who were about to walk into the mouth of hell. The 7th Marines' position on Orange Beach 3 was worse than McNair had imagined. The regiment had landed at 0832 that morning, just 2 minutes behind schedule, and had immediately run into a buzzsaw of Japanese fire. The small island of Peleliu, only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, was supposed to fall in 3 days. General Rupertus had promised it. A quick operation, secure the airfield, move on. But the Japanese had turned the island into a fortress. 500 caves. Tunnels connecting them. 10,000 veteran soldiers who'd decided to fight to the death rather than surrender. The Marines had advanced inland from the beach, pushing toward the airfield, but the cost had been staggering. Every yard was paid for in blood. And now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, the 7th Marines were pinned down in a nightmare of coral ridges and hidden pillboxes, taking fire from positions they couldn't see, losing men faster than they could evacuate them. A white lieutenant with a blood-soaked bandage around his head grabbed Thompson's arm as they approached the line. You, the volunteers from the depot companies? Yes, sir. 7th Ammunition and 11th Depot, 6 men. The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly. McNair saw the recognition there, the moment of hesitation. Black Marines, support troops. Not real infantry. The doubt was written across his face like a neon sign. Then a burst of machine gun fire raked the position, and 3 Marines 20 feet away went down screaming. The doubt vanished. The lieutenant's face hardened. I don't care if you're from the Navy band, we need you on the line. 2nd platoon got hit hard. They got wounded, they can't evacuate, and gaps in the line we can't fill. You bring ammunition up, you take wounded back, and if the Japanese come, you shoot them. Clear. Crystal clear, sir. One more thing. The lieutenant's voice dropped. My boys have been fighting since 0830. They're exhausted and they're scared, and some of them are going to look at you and see Well, they're gonna see what they see. Prove 'em wrong. Show 'em your Marines. McNair felt anger flash hot in his chest, but Thompson's hand on his shoulder steadied him. They didn't have time for anger. They had a job to do. The next 4 hours blurred into a nightmare of smoke and blood and screaming. McNair ran ammunition forward to positions where Marines crouched behind coral outcroppings, their faces hollow with exhaustion. He learned to keep his head down as Japanese snipers fired from the ridges. He learned the specific crack of a Nambu machine gun versus an Arisaka rifle. He learned what a man sounded like when he was dying. And then he learned how to fight. The Japanese counterattack came at 0200 on September 16th, flooding out of the caves in a screaming wave of bayonets and grenades. The 7th Marines line buckled. Men fell, gaps opened. And suddenly McNair wasn't carrying ammunition anymore. He was firing his M1 Garand into the darkness, working the trigger as fast as he could load, watching shapes fall and get back up and keep coming. Beside him, Lee Douglas was fighting with his rifle in one hand and a Kabar knife in the other, face twisted in a snarl that would have terrified anyone who'd ever called him boy. Samuel Love had taken over a 37mm gun whose crew had been killed, firing point blank into the attacking Japanese. Marcus Henderson and William Taylor were working together, one firing while the other reloaded, creating a rhythm of covering fire that held their section of the line. Eugene Foster had found a Japanese Type 96 light machine gun and was using it to devastating effect, the distinctive sound of the enemy weapon creating confusion among the Japanese attackers. They could hear their own gun firing, but from the wrong direction, and it threw off their assault. James Whitfield was moving between positions with a satchel of grenades, throwing them with the precision of a man who'd played baseball before the war. And then McNair saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A young white Marine, couldn't have been more than 18, was lying in the open between their position and the advancing Japanese, screaming for help. He'd been hit in both legs and couldn't move. The Japanese were maybe 30 seconds from overrunning him. McNair didn't think. He just moved. He ran into the open, firing his rifle one-handed to keep the Japanese back, and grabbed the wounded Marine under the arms. The kid weighed maybe 140 soaking wet, but felt like 200 pounds of dead weight as McNair dragged him backward. Bullets kicked up coral dust around them. Something hot creased McNair's shoulder. Might have been a bullet or shrapnel, it didn't matter. He kept moving. Lee Douglas appeared beside him, firing to provide cover. Then Samuel Love was there too, and Marcus Henderson, all of them forming a human shield around the wounded Marine as they dragged him back to the line. James Whitfield threw a grenade that bought them 3 precious seconds. Eugene Foster's machine gun chattered, cutting down the Japanese who'd gotten closest. They made it back. The wounded Marine made it back. And as the corpsman worked on him, the kid looked up at McNair with tears streaming down his face and said, "Thank you." "Oh God, thank you." An older Marine, a sergeant with a southern accent thick enough to cut with a knife, stared at them with something like awe in his eyes. "Black Angels," he whispered. "Y'all are Black Angels." The name spread through that long night as the counterattack raged, and the 6th Black Marines from the depot companies fought alongside white Marines who'd never expected to see them in combat. The name passed from position to position. The Black Angels. Support troops who'd become saviors. Men who weren't supposed to fight, but who fought like demons anyway. By the time dawn broke on September 16th, the Japanese counterattack had been shattered, but the cost had been terrible. The 7th Marines had taken massive casualties. The beach was still under fire, and the operation that was supposed to last 3 days was just beginning. Peleliu would rage on for 73 more days, becoming the bloodiest amphibious assault in Marine Corps history, with a 40% casualty rate that would haunt the Corps for decades. But the 6 Black Marines from the 7th Ammunition Company and 11th Marine Depot Company kept fighting. For the next weeks, they did everything. They hauled ammunition forward under fire. They evacuated wounded under fire. They manned guns whose crews had been killed. They held positions that white Marines had abandoned. They fought hand-to-hand when the Japanese came too close. They proved, over and over again, that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his courage. Reuben McNair would later describe his routine in simple terms that captured the horror and the heroism. Hauling ammunition forward, joining white Marines shoulder to shoulder in firefights. Carrying away the wounded, then returning with more ammunition and fighting again. An endless cycle of combat that should have broken them but somehow didn't. The 11th Marine Depot Company paid the heaviest price. 17 men wounded, the highest casualty rate of any African-American Marine unit in the entire Pacific War. Think about that number. 17 men from a support unit that wasn't supposed to see combat. 17 men who'd been told they weren't good enough to be real Marines. 17 men who bled and suffered, and some of them died, proving that courage doesn't have a color. Major General William H. Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, watched what these Black Marines did on Peleliu. He watched them fight. He watched them save lives. He watched them hold lines that were crumbling. And before the battle was even over, he did something remarkable for 1944. He wrote identical letters to the commanders of the 7th Marine Ammunition Company, the 11th Marine Depot Company, and the 17th Special Naval Construction Battalion. The letters said, "The Negro race can well be proud of the work performed. The wholehearted cooperation and untiring efforts demonstrated in every respect that they appreciate the privilege of wearing a Marine uniform and serving with Marines in combat. Please convey to your command these sentiments and inform them that in the eyes of the entire division they have earned a well done." Read those words carefully. They appreciate the privilege of wearing a Marine uniform, as if the privilege wasn't theirs by right, as if they hadn't earned it with blood and courage, as if they needed to be grateful for the chance to die for a country that still denied them basic civil rights. The condescension in that praise tells you everything about 1944 America. But look past the words to what they represented. A white general in the segregated military of 1944, publicly acknowledging that Black Marines had fought with distinction, that they were, in his words, Marines, not Black Marines, not support troops who'd gotten lucky, just Marines. The Navy made an official press release in November 1944. For a brief moment, America heard about the Black Angels of Peleliu, and then, like so many other stories of Black heroism in World War II, it was quietly forgotten. The strategic importance of Peleliu itself would be questioned for decades. Many historians would argue that the island didn't need to be taken, that it wasn't essential to the advance toward Japan, that those 10,000 American casualties and 11,000 Japanese dead were wasted on an objective that military strategy had already bypassed. Whether that's true or not doesn't change what happened there. Doesn't change what those 6 Black Marines and their brothers in the depot and ammunition companies accomplished. After Peleliu, after the Black Marines of the 7th and 11th had proven themselves in the crucible of the Pacific's bloodiest battle, things should have changed. The Marine Corps should have integrated immediately. Black Marines should have been given full combat training and equal opportunities. They should have been celebrated as heroes. Instead, they went back to hauling supplies. The 51st and 52nd Defense Battalions, the only all-Black combat units the Marine Corps created, spent the entire war garrisoning captured islands without ever firing a shot in combat. Thousands of Black Marines served as stevedores, loading and unloading ships, doing the labor-intensive work that white Marines didn't want to do. Even after Peleliu, even after Saipan, where General Alexander Vandegrift declared the Negro Marines are no longer on trial, they are Marines, period. The institutional racism continued. It would take until 1948, 4 years after these men had proven their worth in blood, for President Truman to sign Executive Order 9981 desegregating the military. And even then, the Marine Corps dragged its feet. Montford Point, the segregated training camp where all Black Marines had been forced to train, didn't close until September 1949. Full integration of the Marines didn't happen until the Korean War in 1952. Think about what that means. The men who fought on Peleliu, who earned the name Black Angels, who saved the lives of white Marines who doubted them, went home to a country where they still couldn't drink from the same water fountains, where they couldn't sit at the same lunch counters, where they'd risked their lives for freedom abroad but were denied equality at home. Reuben McNair, who'd dragged wounded men to safety under fire, who'd fought for 73 days on Peleliu, went home to face the same discrimination he'd faced before the war. Lee Douglas Jr., who'd charged into combat with his rifle blazing, found that his service meant nothing to the Jim Crow South. Samuel Love, Marcus Henderson, William Taylor, Eugene Foster, James Whitfield, all of them discovered that America's memory was short when it came to Black heroism. For decades, their story was buried. Not from malice, necessarily, just from the casual erasure that happens when history is written by those who'd rather not acknowledge uncomfortable truths. The story of Peleliu became about white Marines fighting Japanese defenders. The depot and ammunition companies were mentioned in passing, if at all. The name Black Angels faded from memory. In 2012, 68 years after Peleliu, President Obama awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Montford Point Marines collectively. It was long overdue recognition for men who'd broken the color barrier in the Corps, but by then most of them were gone. The survivors were in their 80s and 90s, their stories preserved only in scattered oral histories and military records that few people ever read. The title of this story mentions witchcraft, suggests that the Japanese thought these Marines were fighting with supernatural power. That's dramatic, makes for a compelling narrative. The truth is more mundane and more powerful. There was no witchcraft on Peleliu. There was no magic. There were just 6 men and their brothers in the depot and ammunition companies who'd been told they weren't good enough and decided to prove otherwise, who'd been trained for 4 weeks instead of 12 and fought just as hard as Marines who'd gotten 3 times the training, who'd been assigned to support roles and became combatants when their country needed them, who were black in an America that didn't want to admit that black men could be heroes. The real witchcraft, if there was any, was the magic of courage under fire. The transformation of men who were supposed to haul supplies into warriors who saved lives. The alchemy that turned discrimination into determination, prejudice into pride, doubt into defiance. That's the story of the Black Marines on Peleliu. Not a myth, not an exaggeration, not a tale enhanced for dramatic effect. Just 6 men and the hundreds of others who served alongside them, doing the impossible because nobody had told them it was impossible. Or maybe because they'd been told it was impossible and decided to do it anyway. When you hear about Peleliu now, when you read about the savage fighting in the Umabrogo Mountains, about Bloody Nose Ridge, about the caves and the heat and the horror, remember the Black Angels. Remember the 7th Marine Ammunition Company and the 11th Marine Depot Company. Remember that 17 men from a support unit were wounded because they volunteered to fight. Remember that Black Marines saved White Marines' lives, even though those same White Marines would go home to a country where they'd be treated better than the men who'd saved them. Remember that the fight for equality, the double victory campaign that Black soldiers and Marines waged during World War II, victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, was being fought on Peleliu's coral ridges just as surely as it was being fought in the streets of American cities. And remember that history has a tendency to forget the inconvenient heroes, the ones whose courage doesn't fit the comfortable narrative, the ones who were written out of the story because their presence reminded America of its own failures. The Black Marines of Peleliu fought 2 wars, one against the Japanese, one against the racism that told them they weren't good enough to fight in the first place. They won the first war, there on that small island in the Pacific. The second war would take decades longer. But their courage, their sacrifice, their determination to prove themselves, that's eternal. That's the real story. And it's one that should never be forgotten again.